I actually went around my own family and I'm like, I'm not getting married, I'm not having kids, so I don't hear it. Partly, I think early on, I stopped that own thing in my head where I said, folks might want this, but like at the end of the day, I've got to bear this kid. I've got to figure out the family thing. And so when I just started telling everybody, I'm not getting married, I'm not having kids, man, it was at a release. But like it was as much in my own head that I didn't need to do that, right?
Yeah.
Because when I said I made time in business school for really building good friendships, I did. I not only found my husband, which I didn't mean to, but like found really good friends who for the rest of my life now tell you the truth.
Like, how would you tell somebody, millennial women now in the workforce who's probably high up there, how do you still find that balance?
Sometimes it's the way we define life can help tremendously. And so the fact that fun was defined as work for my male colleagues, I was like, that's brilliant. In creating leaders of the world, but have these leaders ever walk the shoes of the folks that they are going to lead? And it occurred to me that it's really easy to make decisions if you just don't see certain things. And the complexity of it is understanding what's happening in these communities with these great and big innovative ideas.
So I'm very excited for my audience today because I have somebody very special that I've been trying to bring onto the show for a couple of months, and I'm so excited that we got the opportunity to bring her on here. She's somebody with an incredible resume and somebody that I really believe will speak to the millennial generation and help us answer some of the questions that we're trying to figure out as we go through life in a different area than maybe our parents had gone through here. So I'm going to give a brief introduction of her. She has a very long list of accomplishments. I could spend the entire podcast going over everything here, but I am speaking to somebody who grew up in the Central Valley of California, one of the poorest, if not the poorest county in the state of California. She went to Stanford, double majored in economics and politics, was also on the baseball and the volleyball team, if I'm correct. Basketball team.
Basketball and
softball team. There we go.
You got it.
Went to Harvard, graduated there with an MBA, went into politics, worked for Senator Feinstein. Senator Debbie Stabenow became the first Latina Chief of Staff in the history of the United States Senate. From then on, she went on to being Hillary Clinton's political director in the 2016 presidential campaign. She ran for governor of the state of California and also ran for Congress in the 21st or the 22nd. I always mix that one up.
21st.
The 21st congressional district, and she's married to a husband with two beautiful young children. And by the way, she's also the CEO of a company. So without further ado, I am very excited to have Amanda Renteria on my show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming out.
Man. It's really good to be here. It's good to be talking to your audience. And because I often say, y'all are going to lead the world, right? You're going to lead the world in which my kids grow up. And so it's great to be here.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Now, is it Renteria or do you have to roll the R?
Puede ser los dos. Renteria.
You know, the bad thing about that, believe it or not, I never learned Spanish all the way through.
Hey, there's time. There's time. There's always time. And when you start, having kids, you start to think about, all right, what kind of skills do you want? I wish my kids knew more. They know 2 languages. I wish they knew 4. But there's always time.
There's always time. You're absolutely right on that one. And when I was a kid, I did ask my mom that. I said, "Hey, how come I never learn Spanish? What happened?" And I thought it would have been a simple answer, like, I was gonna get to it, but we never did or whatnot. But she actually was telling me that she grew up in Berkeley in the 50s, born in 51, so late 50s, early 60s. And she's like, actually, back then, it was taboo to speak Spanish over here. She's like, my mom, my grandmother told her, hey, I don't want you to even tell her dad, I don't want you speaking Spanish out there. You don't do that. You want to speak English and fit in. And she's telling me this, and it's like the late 80s, early 90s. And I'm like, really? Because everybody here speaks Spanish. Why is it taboo? It didn't really click in my head. Mm-hmm. Then I get older, and then I start seeing, where, okay, now I see a bigger picture of the world. I can kind of see how maybe back then it was just a different world back then, that it was all about fitting in. It wasn't necessarily about, embracing your culture or heritage. And it's such a great thing to see how far this country's come in 70 or so years.
Heck yeah.
So it's been something that, the funny thing is, my dad told me, actually, I want you to learn Japanese. I said, why Japanese? He's like, well, because, this is, again, back in the 90s when Japan was they came out of that 80s boom. Everything was being made in Japan. He's like, I want you to learn it because that's where the money's going to be. You're going to be a businessman. You got to learn Japanese. You're going to be way ahead of the game. I said, okay. I took 6 years of Japanese between college and high school.
Good for you.
Thank you. But it's hard to keep it up when you don't speak it out loud to everybody. So when I go to Japan, I get to practice it. But coming out here, it's like, all right, I get just in your comfort zone.
Yeah. No, I think, one of my philosophies in life is speak as many languages as you can. And I don't just mean language, the actual language, but the language of education, the language of business, the language of technology, of politics, right? And in that same vein, because it's such a language and the way we communicate is such an understanding of a culture and a different just way of living, you really see it through language.
Yeah.
That I've always believed in that. And that's why I wish I knew more languages or that my kids knew more languages, because it does allow you into different worlds.
You're definitely right. I mean, I have friends here who they're teaching their children Spanish, English, Chinese. They're like, hey, this is the way the world's going. You want to learn all three. And to be a kid again where you can just absorb it all so easily like that, like, oh man, it's like, there are definitely times where I wish I was still a kid again to be able to get that experience. But I'm obviously very grateful for where I've come from. And speaking of that, I've been so impressed, obviously, in just that short biography I gave of you of what you've done, and just hearing your story from how you've explained it in the past, I think really resonates not just with me and my background, but also so many people in my generation that are, being told about this is how you're supposed to live life. This is what the way of the world is. California, guess what? Your homes are going to cost about $2 million. What are you going to do about it? Well, you got to react. And a lot of people in my generation are, especially in my part of the generation, the older millennials, like 35 to 40, there's almost this sense of, hey, we were supposed to accomplish X amount by this time, and we're still trying to figure it out. And a lot of us just have questions about how does that actually happen here? And you have such an incredible story, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell your story about your upbringing and how you got to where you came from, and just go through all that whole thing for me.
Sure. Well, you're asking me on a really special time, because tomorrow I'm headed back to my hometown because I will be inducted into the Hall of Fame in my little town in Woodlake.
Wow.
And so it's totally special for me. And it really is, this idea of strong roots. And I grew up in, and somebody's castle where you grow up, right, is what you think of it. And I grew up in this little town, and I think over time I realized when you grow up there, you don't know that you are living in the lowest income congressional district in the entire state. You don't know that you are living in, among the poorest 10 districts across the entire country. What you do know is that you are growing up in an environment that loves you, that tells you you can do anything, and you don't know any better as a kid. And so you grow up thinking that, believing that, working hard for that. And so over the course of my life, I grew up there. My parents were farm workers. That's how we ended up in this little town. And I became the first woman and the first Latina from my high school to go to Stanford. And for me, that was the big aha moment where, one, I didn't know no woman or no Latina had ever gone to Stanford. But two, I had no idea why it would be meaningful to do so. Right? I had a teacher because I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I had a teacher who pulled me aside and he said, listen, this isn't about you. This is about your community, and that somebody like them can succeed at a place like that. And that was everything to me. It's not only why I ended up going to Stanford, but in those hard days, man, when I just wasn't sure I could make it through because my high school didn't prepare me for something like Stanford.
Right.
And so I had to do the extra books in order to just make it through the introductory class. It was those moments of walking back to the dorm with that heavy backpack with the extra books and going, wait a second, it's not just me, right? It's an entire community coming with me. And when you're taking that along the journey with you, you kind of can do anything, right? Because It's not just you, right? You're bringing your dad's story and my grandma's story and everyone that's in my community and bringing their story along with me. And that's really what's allowed me to do things that maybe others looked at and said, that's impossible. And you're like, you're right. It is impossible as a 5'4" kid to walk onto the national defending women's basketball team. But when I am bringing my cousins and, my friends along, it makes it a little bit easier. It makes that extra work a little bit easier to do, and the belief in support always there by your side.
Wow. And talk to me a little bit about the inspiration from your parents, because they came here in what year?
Gosh, my dad came when he was 11. My mom was born here in Santa Ana. She's Mexican American. And yeah, my dad came here about at the age of 10, had to go back to Mexico. Over the course of our country's, America's history, there's been a lot of different back and forth in how to become a citizen. Mm-hmm. And so he and his family had to go back for a while. He talks a lot about being in Tijuana and being a shoe shiner there. See, he says he was like the best shoe shiner ever. My dad was the best everything, which is just a beautiful thing about who he is. But he went back and forth, and the way Woodlake ended up becoming a little town is it was one of the labor camps, actually one of the labor camps that over time got dismantled across the state because they weren't quite, it was a tough, kids were working, all kinds of different labor laws were not really being applied or followed, and then that labor camp became the town. And so I actually grew up with a lot of the folks that were in my parents' labor camp. They ended up forming a Mexican dancing group. And so my real understanding of my culture and all of that was dancing around the country, around the state, learning and showcasing, different regions of Mexico, Jalisco, Veracruz. And so my first understanding of Mexican culture was on a stage.
Wow.
And that's really where I have such a pride in Renteria, right? And like Zacatecano, that's what my dad was, or is. So, and I think when I now think about my kids growing up, right, what sort of pride do you inject at those early ages? Not just the pride of hard work and the story, but the who you are, right? Because that never goes away.
True.
Right? That's the roots.
So tell me about the mindset of your parents growing up, because it was a different time. It was the 1950s, I believe, correct?
Yeah.
And the world was different. I mean, the idea of what our roles were in the world were just totally different. But tell me about what they taught you about to give you the inspiration to say you can do things that, pretty much nobody around here has done or ever thought about doing, to get you to the point where you said, Stanford University? That's how does wow.
Yeah. My parents are just such special people, and they were in the fields when Cesar Chavez and Robert Kennedy came to break the fast in Delano. They were actually in the fields as the field workers. My mom still talks about she actually got to shake the hand of Robert Kennedy. She still remembers. She tells the story beautifully. But when you grow up hearing the stories, and in some ways, I don't remember actually, quote, being lectured to, per se. I just remember my parents telling us the stories, and it would come in different ways, and I'd be like, Mom, Dad, the kids go camping, let's go camping. And she's like, Mija, I never want to be in a tent again. Don't you understand that we had to live in tents over the summers in order to pick fruit? And we'd go from one to the other, and we were always dirty, and I hated it, and that's how we lived. It was just like kind of moments like that where you're like, oh, right? Like, that's real. Like, you did that for me, right? Like, you guys came here to figure out how to have a better life for us. This is what it all meant. So it was moments like that that really kind of gave us a picture. But even in their own lives and like the journeys they lead, my dad often talked about, when he was a shoe shiner, and then when he was a janitor and a bus driver and a home builder, and then he owned his own business.
Man.
And so when you see the journey of him telling those stories, right, him talking about the fact that he couldn't get loans, right? As a Latino man, it was really hard for people to get loans. And he talked about who he relied on. He remembered that guy who gave him a chance. And so I sort of learned the world in not just the barriers, but the chances life gives you in order to figure it out. And so I was lucky. I feel like I had a real opening of not everything's going to be easy. Sometimes it's going to be harder for you.
Yes.
Right? But also look for those angels, those moments that can pull you in to help you, and don't be afraid to take them. And so that's a lot of what I've learned over time. And, my parents don't stop. My mom, who's a secretary for the schools for 36 years and then retired, decided upon retirement that she'd run for school board. She ended up winning.
Jeez.
And so, I often think about, for all of us, right, be careful who you're working with, or, just how you see people in the world. They might be your boss someday, but also, people's journeys are ongoing. And certainly my mom's continued, and she ended up being the only woman on the school board as it consolidated. And it was a really beautiful for her, right? A trajectory of her life.
It's just, that's just a powerful statement there, because it was one thing that my mom always told me. Well, both my mom and my dad growing up was that we want you to have a better life than, we ever did or ever could. Not that we had bad lives, but we want you to take it to the next step. Whatever that looks like for you, we want you to make sure you have the freedom to go and do that. And they said that may not mean following the traditional route of, you got to graduate high school and then you got to be married by 21 and then you got to start your family. My dad would always, he would never say it directly, but I knew what he was thinking. He said, honestly, if you were to get married now and have a bunch of bambinos and stay at home, I would be totally happy with it. And I was like, I'm 23 at the time. I said, I kind of want to get my life started first in terms of my career, whatever. And my mom was more pushing me to that. She was actually, when she was growing up, she actually had her own apartment at like age 19 or so. And this is 60 something. That just wasn't something that you saw back then. But she was living on her own. She learned how to be independent before she got married. And then now that my dad's passed on, she reverts back to what she learned being on her own and saying, this is what's keeping me going now, is that I've learned how to survive all those years on my own. I didn't depend on anybody specifically, but now I'm kind of doing my own thing now. I enjoy doing it. I enjoy my privacy, my life, what I can do on my own. And she's like, I never want you, meaning me, to feel like you have to give me grandchildren or you have to, do this for the family and whatnot. She's like, you're in a different spot now. This is a different world than what I grew up in, meaning what she grew up in. And especially the cost of living around here, it's a different beast to actually tackle. Mm-hmm. So it's, hearing you say that, I relate to it in so many different ways like that. So how would your dad, or I kind of want to focus on your father here. Like, how did he, what was he saying that gave you that confidence to say, go out there and do it? Even though I'm sure he's probably got everybody else telling him, hey, this is how things are over here, why go outside the box?
My dad always has pushed us to whatever you're going to do it con todo, right? Con ganas. Like, you got one shot at this, kid. That's always been his way of thinking, his way of living. And for us, it was interesting. And I think one of my earliest memories was that I was always kind of pretty good at sports, but it wasn't, from my extended family, it wasn't a thing that a girl should waste her mind on. I was also a good student, so my aunts actually and some of my extended family were like, you got to take her out of sports. She's got to learn how to, she's got to learn school. She's got to be good in school. And my dad's theory on it was like, no, she could do both. Right? And she's going to do both. And I think I just remembered how much I loved playing sports, and I knew I was good at it. And hearing my dad, who what I knew was a traditional thing, hearing him stick up for me in a non-traditional way and saying, because my dad's pretty Mexicano, has all those things that sometimes I get a little frustrated with him by, he's in charge, that kind of thing. But to see him go, all right, this might be different than my traditional culture, and I am good with that because my daughter's pretty good and she can do all things. That stuck at a really early age for me.
Was there ever pressure to say, we want grandchildren now, all that stuff like that, time's a ticking. Man.
You know how many times I would get that? I got that so much. When, mija, we're waiting, right? Not from my dad, more from my tias, right? Cuando, right? We want the little kids. And to the point that I actually went around my own family. I'm like, I'm not getting married. I'm not having kids, so I don't hear it. And then strangely, you meet someone and they're like, she's going to get married. She's going to have kids. I mean, even my sister often when I had a kid, she was like, wow, Amanda, you did it. I was like, I know. So, I mean, partly, I think early on, I stopped that own thing in my head where I said, yes, folks might want this, but at the end of the day, I've got to bear this kid. I've got to figure out the family thing. And so when I just started telling everybody, I'm not getting married, I'm not having kids, man, it was at a release. But it was as much in my own head that I didn't need to do that, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly when that happened, but it was incredibly freeing.
I believe it. And, not so much on my side of the family, but I've known people where you're right. The extended family starts to interject and say, hey, this is, and it's almost although they mean well with it, absolutely. It's almost like by you having your children now, it gives us more things to do, more of a purpose. Yeah. It's like, is that the real reason why? Like, that was kind of my dad's mindset. He never said it specifically, but he's like, if I had grandkids, I could be, I could, do these things with them. I could take them to the park, whatever. And like, that's great, but I got to pay the bills. I got to be the one to go out there and work. So you get to enjoy them, but hey, I got to go, do everything to make sure that they can survive. Yeah. So talk to me about Stanford, and why Stanford?
Yeah. I mean,
it sounds like an obvious question, why Stanford, but I kind of want to hear from you specifically.
It wasn't an immediate, that's where I should go. I applied because I had a cousin who was applying to all these different schools. And honestly, I was like that kid who applied for everything. Like there was the clearinghouse, right, where you can win $1 million.
Oh, God. Yeah, I remember those.
I used to apply to that because I was like, someday I'm going to win $1 million, even though like I could never get any of the magazines, right?
Yeah.
Like, but so I was like that kid, like, why not? Like, I fill out forms, let's apply. And so I kind of applied to all these different schools that came in the mail, and I was a good student, so there was a lot of marketing at that time. And I had an uncle who worked in LA. He was a professor at a college teaching Chicano studies. And his daughter and I were applying to a lot of different schools. And so he had a bunch of different applications. He's like, oh, why don't you apply to Stanford? Why don't you apply? And my honest response, I knew enough about Stanford. I was like, I'm not applying to no nerd school. Like, that was my response. Because I was cool, right? Like,
yeah,
I was cool.
Why would you want to,
Who's not cool, right? And that's at least my thinking at 16 years old. And then I applied, and I got in, and it was over the intercom at school. And I almost can remember in Miss Welch's class, sitting in that chair, hearing my name over the intercom, saying, Amanda Renteria got into Stanford, and everyone cheering, and I just sank in my chair, largely because I wasn't sure I was going to go. I honestly, it was like one of those, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay for it? At the time, I had a full ride scholarship to a local university where I was going to be able to start on the basketball team, have it paid for. My parents were going to be near. It was a Christian school, and so of course my parents really liked that idea.
I believe it.
And all of a sudden, I was like, "This is something. Like, I did something, and I don't know now how I'm going to go there. And it seems like I should really think about whether or not I'm going to go there." So it was it was a little bit of a scary moment for me, and hearing and seeing how proud everyone was, but then not knowing how I'm going to do it. That was a thing for a 16, 17-year-old at the time.
Wow. And I can only imagine the pressure you probably felt, not just to succeed in it, but that it's almost a representation of where I came from, the first person to go to Stanford from this small community. And it's hard to ask that of anybody that period, but to somebody that age, when you're still trying to figure out life and what goes where and whatnot, to have that type of pressure on you, did you really process that, or it was, hey, I'm just going to focus on it and then not worry about what this means for my community or my family, and if I don't do well there, that it reflects bad on something like that? Did you ever really have to worry about that?
Sometimes I think about this as I see my own kids make decisions, is sometimes it's really simple, right? Sometimes if you just step back and go, I could go here, and I know a lot of people who've done that. Or I could go here, and I know nobody who's done that before. And yes, you have that sinking feeling in your stomach, but you also are like, kind of cool, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so at the time, it was scary. I didn't know exactly how I would do it. But I knew what one path was. I had seen it. And so there was something like I could see myself doing it, but there was something really enticing about this fact that how can I say no, right? I get this chance that other people didn't get. How can I say no? And this is where the story, I think, of my parents have consistently come into play when I've chosen the path no one else has walked. Mm-hmm. It's because so did my parents. Right? And like, if they had the chance, and I think in my own mind, I think about it, I think if they had the chance, I know they'd pick the path no one's taken. I know it.
Yeah.
Right? That's so easy for me to know that's what they do. And I think that's kind of a motivating factor, which is I wish if there's anything I could change in the world, I wish I could see my mom and dad born today. and what they would do with their lives.
To see that opportunity.
Yeah.
Just, wow. You're right. So many opportunities now that even though they may have existed back then, it wasn't like, it didn't seem realistic. It was like, I could do it, but come on, am I really going to do all that? And a lot of us just talk ourselves out of it.
Yeah.
Like,
Like I often am like, what kind of baller would my mom be? She was taller than I am. She's pretty strong. And when I see her play volleyball, I'm a little impressed.
How was that daily life? I mean, trying to balance two sports with education, with the studying, and then you were living on, I'm sure you're living on campus, correct?
Yeah.
So just, how did you balance, like, just at that age, being able to give your full effort to everything? And what was that like?
Well, some of it you don't know any better, right? So you just got to do it.
True. Yeah.
And thank goodness for ignorance. But for me, when I got to Stanford, I didn't know how I was going to pay for it. At the time, it was $22,000 a year, which is the most money I'd ever heard of. And there was always a fear for me that my parents were going to have me move back home. And so I didn't realize we'd have such a bill at the end of it. And so I started to go, how do I get it paid for? And when you start to ask your academic advisor, how do you get it paid for? And she kind of off the cuff goes like, listen, it's okay. Like, you're going to be fine when you graduate from Stanford. You're going to have debt. And you're like, I don't know where that doesn't sound fine, right? Like, especially when you don't grow up in places that understand that or can get that, or think about like the fact that you're going to graduate and have debt. And so I said, well, how do I get, like, not have it? She's like, well, the only people that actually kind of like figure out how not to have debt is folks who like play sports, get a scholarship. I was like, I could play sports. Where do I go? That's how I ended up walking on to the basketball team and the softball team and earning a scholarship.
Wow. Okay.
Figure it out.
You're just like, okay, here's the bill. Now, what can I do to pay for it? Oh, look at if you're good enough to get on the on the basketball or the softball team, then and the coach says yay, then this debt's going to go away.
Well, and it was at a time where Title IX had been around a while. It was since I was born, I think when I was 2 is when Title IX passed. But at that time, it was starting to get into college sports now, where the scholarships for women's sports was going up in order to get to equality. And so I knew there were some openings there, and I knew that colleges, and that was like the buzz around at the time. So I knew there was an opportunity there. I just had to work for it and earn it, right? And that I think in my life is probably one of the specialties where I might not be the smartest or like the tallest or the strongest, but I'll pride myself in working the hardest. And so that was the model. And so in some ways, it wasn't until I graduated that I looked back and realized, what was I thinking, right? But when you're just trying to make it work, it's amazing what you can do, right? It's amazing what your body and mind can do when it's asked to push to the limits of like figuring it out. So when I was in it, was it hard? Yes. Did I have to move from the 3rd floor to the 1st floor during our conditioning workout? Because Stanford was known to have the toughest conditioning in the country. Yes. But at the moment, you're just doing it.
Wow. And you were in a sorority?
Sort of. I played around with, I wanted to do everything at Stanford, right? I was on the Ballet Folklorico dancing group. I did a thesis. I did sports. I dabbled in a sorority. I didn't have time. Like, if there's anything that fell off is some of the social aspects of Stanford. That's
a big thing there that I wanted to get into. Actually, I want to ask you this, and we'll kind of see how it transitions, because it may jump around a little bit, but your senior thesis on women in politics, what did that, in writing that, I know you were going with the time and the studies and whatnot. Yeah. How did that, like, if you were to review that now, knowing what you had been through in politics, were you on the right track, or did you get into politics saying, well, I had no idea that this is how it really was based upon my studying? Or, you know what? Things have been changing so much for the better. I'm glad that what I wrote back then is applying to today's day.
So a couple things. I actually wanted to write women of color in politics, but there weren't enough to really put a study together. And so my advisor at the time said, well, just then do it in women in politics, right? And we'll do an addendum for women of color in politics. So that in itself, the fact that has changed is fantastic.
Yes.
And I think I was onto something in that sense, which is, gosh, we need a lot more voices. The thesis actually was about how these political leaders look at things based on their lived experience. We didn't have that term at the time, but that's what I was looking at. And what I was trying to do in Women of Color in Politics is how women of color decide when race and gender on a subject sort of clash. What do they do? Where do they land? What I learned about the entire thesis, what I took away, is that elected leaders, these women that I interviewed, were frankly just really practical. They went with what they could get past. And so even when you talk to them and they would say, I'd really love to work on this maternity care issue for Black women or for Latino women, they knew they were so far away from that. So instead, they worked on the housing issue that, the real estate folks wanted to work on that affected, women in X community.
Right.
And so it was interesting because I thought coming into it that when you become an elected leader, you have all this freedom. And like, gosh, if you just have a voice, then you can do it. And what I realized is the system of politics and policy itself is pretty confining. And so what it led me to believe is we need a hell of a lot more women, a heck of a lot more women of color, a heck of a lot more different perspectives, because you will always be confined by the majority of the leadership.
Right. I mean, that's such a rabbit hole too when we get into politics and how bills are passed in the Senate, the lobbyists, and then you have to sign this bill for them to get support for that bill. It's most people don't realize just how conflated that whole system really is. You think you elect like somebody, they stand on these principles. Well, they're going to go to Washington, they're going to vote for that, and life's good, right? And then it's like, it doesn't work that way. I mean, we like it to work that way, but this is how the system of politics works. And it's for better or for worse. Some people might say it's really horrible and it's definitely not perfect, but it's like, do we have a better example that we can point to out in the world with the way some of these countries run their own systems? Actually, kind of going back to Stanford, this was something that I was thinking about. So you're at Stanford. You're in the age of 18 to 23. You graduated in 4 years?
5.
5 years. That's still impressive to graduate. Nowadays, it's like if you get out in 6 years.
That was my negotiation. Actually, I stopped playing basketball and I played softball, and then I could have that 4th year.
Oh.
So
Okay, see the way the system works there. So you're in the early 20s, and it's a time that as we've gone on, we start to realize that at that age, even though we all think we know everything, there's so much that our brain still hasn't really figured out yet. Like, it's still developing how we process normal decisions, how we get through life, what we think of as right or wrong. Which is why when I was a teenager and I thought I knew everything, and Dad said, "You don't know anything." I'd be talking about, of course I know. That was your life. That was the day. I know what I'm doing there. And then you get older, you realize, actually, he was right. I don't know why I didn't see it back then, but yeah, he was right. So back then in your early 20s, what was your main, you had already decided at that point that, hey, I'm not getting married, not having kids. I'm going to focus on my schooling, and wherever that takes me, I'm going to go there. At what point did you decide, hey, you know what? I want to get into politics? Or was that after your time at Goldman Sachs?
No, well, I wrote about it, right, in undergrad. I saw it as a venue of making an impact. I didn't necessarily... I can't say I totally saw myself in it. I at that age, when I went to Goldman Sachs, I still was very much in, I have to learn how to wear a suit. I have to learn what different wines are and how to go to cloth napkin restaurants, right? Like all of that. I had so much learning to do. And so that for me was still very much almost academic in that sense. I had to learn what the books that people read in these kinds of environments. I mean, all of that. And so when, after being there for 3.5 years, and it was an incredible learning experience. I mean, I was at Goldman when the .com was still expanding, when derivatives were still expanding, when the euro happened, and I worked in currency. Goldman went public while I was there, and so I got to be a part of that and see what that was all about. So there was so much learning I did. But then once I was there for 3.5 years, I went, do I want my career here? And when I started to kind of really understand that that's not who I was, it was a skill I had and I was pretty good at it. And the intensity of it and all of that was me. But my heart, my connection wasn't quite it. And what I will say is it goes back to my hometown, because I was visiting my mom, and my mom's talking to her comadre at a basketball game, and she's like, what's your daughter doing now, right? Like, we remember she went to Stanford, like, ahora, what's she doing? Mom's like, well, she's kind of at a bank, it's kind of like a bank teller, and,
really?
And I remember thinking, Mom, I'm not kind of like a bank teller, like, I'm doing these really cool, interesting stuff, and then I was like, wait a second, she's not wrong. Like, I am moving money, and I could hear it in her voice, and even in her comadre's voice, like, oh, okay. where there was like this missing pride, right? Like I was supposed to do something. I was supposed to help others, I guess is the language I heard out of that. And that really did shape I've got to figure this out. I've got to figure out to whom much is given, much is expected. And that's really when I started going, I got to go back home. I got to figure it out. I was a teacher, applied for business school, knew I really wanted to give back in some way, whether it was an education or nonprofit. I hadn't figured it out. And so I went to business school with this idea that I was going to now figure it out. Now I was grown up, right? I went to Goldman. I could have a good job. Now I was going to figure it out. And I landed in figuring it out. I landed in public service.
I like how you just said, I went to a business school. Forgot to mention that was Harvard Business School. To me, that's kind of a big deal to go to Harvard there. Yeah. What was that experience? Is that, because at that point you're at your master's degree at Harvard. So it's a little bit different environment than when you're in the undergrad there. You get to focus more on what it is you need to do as opposed to, trying to play sports or whatnot. How was that experience for you there?
Yeah, I mean, you learned a whole another world, right? I was a West Coast girl, and I'm like West Coast in all kinds of ways I didn't know until all of a sudden you're at Harvard and you're freezing and you're going under the tunnels because you just can't handle the cold. But also just the old establishment, money, institutions, history, right? So there's a lot that is different on the East Coast for me, and being at Harvard for me was a really good soft landing, in that I got to kind of see it and understand it all, and as a student have the time to reflect about who I was and how I was interacting with this school. I realized while I loved the skill of business, I struggled a lot with the idea that it's all about chasing the dollar, right? I understood at Goldman sort of how the organization worked and did you make money today or not, and the simplicity of that sort of theory. But being at business school, I struggled a lot with just the moments of money at all costs. Like that's what you're chasing. You're chasing the shareholder dollar. And for a kid like me going, hold on a second, doesn't it matter where it's made and who makes it and how the ecosystem around that works?
Yeah.
It also occurred to me when we were talking about a Walmart case and everyone was talking about value. And I asked the professor asked the question, like, has anyone been to a Walmart? And there was like maybe 2 people at the time. This was early on in the early days. There's like 2 people who raised their hand. And my question was like, does anyone have an aunt or uncle who's ever worked at Walmart? I do. Right? And you kind of like look around and you're like, oh, no one else does. Got it. Right? And you begin to realize you're at an institution that prides himself in creating leaders of the world, but have these leaders ever walked the shoes of the folks that they are going to lead? And it occurred to me that it's really easy to make decisions if you just don't see certain things. And the complexity of it is understanding what's happening in these communities with these great and big innovative ideas. And so Harvard for me was a real moment of reflection to understand how important it was to bring my lived experience to whatever else I was going to do in life. And I think I had a time and a moment to understand that my colleagues growing up in the same generation as I was, who were supposed to be leaders, were missing this aspect. So it's no surprise that the daughter of farm workers meets the son of factory workers and we get married. Actually, since we brought that up, how did you meet Patrick? Yeah, we were in the same section and we were
at Harvard, correct?
At Harvard Business School, yeah. And he was a Boston Irish kid and got really lucky in his younger years to go to a really great school. It really was the story of the daughter of farm workers meets son of factory workers. And I don't know if there was very many other folks like us there. I mean, we're still friends with a lot of them. And our stories are quite unique in that kind of environment. And we met because, and this is kind of the fun stuff, we met because the last row in a Harvard Business School class makes fun of the entire class every single week.
Really?
But it's a selection bias because you can show up to do this if you're in the last row. That's your job, right? You can. But some people show up and some people don't show up to make up the play that's going to make fun of everybody. Well, Pat and I were 2 of the 3 people that showed up to actually do that. And so a little bit of fun, a little bit of just recognizing the opportunity we had to be there kind of brought us together.
That's incredible. And you graduated Harvard at what age? Like 29, 30?
Yeah, 27.
27 years old.
27.
Yeah. Wow, that's unbelievable. And we haven't even gotten yet into like the political career yet, but I've noticed just in talking to you here and like I explained to you earlier, when I was explaining your story to so many people, especially a lot of millennial women, I mean, within my circle of contacts here, I have young women now, or in their late 20s, early 30s, who are doing great things. They own companies. They're big in companies like Apple. One of them is ahead of one of the very special Apple products. Awesome. Working at Salesforce, they're climbing up the ladder, the education. There's so many opportunities there. But from what they were telling me, some of them directly, some of them not so directly, was they really want to know. Millennial women want to know when you're somebody that has this education there and you're going to these great schools and you're doing a lot of jobs here too. It's so ambitious and they want to strive for that. And then sort of the reality comes in. How do you balance everything? How do you balance not just pursuing your career, but even having time to find a relationship? Like, were you looking for that? You know, do you reach a point where you say, you know what, I'm so focused on my career because I can control that. I want to do great things here. And if it happens for me that I meet somebody great, and if it doesn't, then, you know, what do I do? How do I answer my mother? Or how do I, you know, there's a lot of things that I personally cannot relate to there just from my experiences and hearing from that. That's a big question that a lot of women are trying to answer now. And I'm kind of curious on your example, like, what's your advice up to this point now when you're in your late 20s, how you got through that and where your mindset was there?
You know, I'm, again, goes back to my parents. I was really lucky that from the earliest days I can remember, it has always been work hard, play hard with my family. You know, like I work hard, play hard with my family. Like I remember the, you know, even when they talk about being in the labor camps, right? You'd work all day, but then at night the music would come on and everyone would be dancing, right? I mean, that's just what you do. And I think I've always had, like, whenever anyone's around the Renteria family, there's always where's the fun? Where is it happening? And what I think over the course of my life I have taken with me is that I'm going to work hard. I know that. I have no doubt about that. But am I remembering to play hard too? And that part, I think, is actually a magic that keeps you going. And if we miss it, at those moments when I can remember where it wasn't fun, where I couldn't find the places to have some fun and laugh and smile about something, those were the hardest in my career. When it was just this seriousness or this sense of responsibility-ness, right? Mm-hmm. I think we still need that outlet. And for some, you get it when you have kids. But like, even before the kids, we got to make our own fun. Right. Because that's what keeps it going, right? And even now, as a CEO of an organization, I think you would, the other day, I did get introduced by one of my senior staffers as like, you know, Amanda, one of the things that's been so interesting is like, we're taking on this work, but you seem to have fun when you do this. And it's true, I do, but it's intentional. It's not, you have to make it, right? You have to see it and you have to say, you know what, I kind of want to show up to our all staff meeting in a funny hat, or, you know, I kind of want to make this joke in this, like, cause it's kind of funny. And so I don't know. I know some people, especially when you're a young woman and a young woman of color, there were many times where I had to tell myself, okay, you have to look serious and you have to be in charge, right? Like there's this persona of that. And I started to sort of splice in some jokes here and there, or just, you know, some lightness. And do you give up a little bit of the credibility? Yeah, but you know what? People want to interact with you. And at the end of the day, that's what makes life fun, is that you are actually connecting, not just on a work level, but like on a humanity level, right?
That's a great point, because that is a challenge. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, that some people have told me. It's like, I have to go into that business meeting and I have to put on this image, otherwise I'm not taken seriously, or otherwise I can't, you know, they won't see the accomplishments that I've actually done. And, you know, and I try to tell some people from the other stuff is, yes, you want to show that, you know, you understand what you're talking about. It's going to gain you a lot of respect that way. But to show you're also human too, a little lightheartedness, people relax a little bit. They're like, okay, I'm not afraid now if I say the wrong thing, or I'm not afraid that I have to be, you know, rigid too, just talking to you, because I know that we can have a conversation and we understand, okay, this is work, this is serious, you know, but let's have a joke here and there to show that we are human. That's a big struggle that I hear a lot about. And like, how would you tell somebody, especially a young woman, a millennial woman now in the workforce, who's probably high up there, VPs or owners of a company, how do you still find that balance, and how important it actually is to do that?
Yeah. Here's what I'll say is take a page out of some of my male colleagues as sort of what I learned, right? They were like going off golfing or having a beer. And I was like, wait a second, you all have time for a beer? Like, how do you have time for a beer? And they're like, Amanda, like, this is work. Having a beer or going out on the golf on the golf course is work. And I was like, oh, I have it all wrong. Right? Like the fun part is work.
Wow.
And that for me was a big opening where all of a sudden I didn't feel guilty about the fun. I didn't feel guilty about going out with my comadres and having a glass of wine and sharing what happened at work, that was actually work. And so sometimes it's the way we define life can help tremendously. And so the fact that fun was defined as work for my male colleagues, I was like, that's brilliant.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because it's such a simple thing to be able to say, yeah, well, we have to go out and like go to the golf course or go out and have a drink. It's like, I'm sure you saw that a lot at Goldman Sachs too. I mean, you had people saying, hey, we're going to take this new client out to this bar over here. They have great drinks. And somebody can look at that as like, well, you guys are just going to party? But no, we're actually conducting business. Right. But I have to get my clients comfortable, and I have to provide this or whatever. And that's sort of part of it too. That's a great thing to say there.
And I think, all these young women who are getting into these roles, you can define what it is, right? It doesn't mean you have to go to the bar and do it you can say, we're going to go on a spa trip, right? So when I was on the Hill, all the women chiefs got together and we would do things that were not just like the guys, right? We went on different kinds of trips to art. We went to go to a museum. We went to go, we actually did wine and painting, right? And so, and we like sort of joke about the fact that we were way more creative and way more fun than they were. But only to say we can stretch that out, right? You want to go on a shopping that's fine. That could be work, just like the golf course. So what? It's not the golf course. And we get to define those kinds of things now.
Exactly. It's such a strong point, and I do want to tie that into when we get into your political career after Harvard here. But one thing I want to touch on really fast, another question that I get a lot, and it's something that I hear with a lot of women, but it's kind of hard to ask that question. Up until the age when you were 27, you weren't looking for anybody special. Patrick just sort of fell in your lap, correct? Like where we're at?
Yeah. I mean, I was pretty certain I wasn't getting married. Yes. So one of our questions was like, he's like, oh, so are you going to get married? I was like, I'm not getting married. Why would I ever get married?
So like at that age, you're in your late 20s. This is the time that a lot of my female friends are saying that they feel the pressure that they have to have children now, in a way that I cannot relate to it as a guy. So what kind of advice would you give to somebody that age who's trying to follow her career? Yeah. She's doing everything right to get there, but then she's got these questions, whether they're from external sources like family or society, or within her own mind of, okay, am I doing it correctly? What if I have the regrets? Like, how would you tell somebody that?
Yeah, so this is a hard one because I feel very lucky that, one, this was intentional. When I went to business school, I knew that was a moment for making relationships. Like whether or not I got married or not, I was going to invest in making relationships because I know how hard I work. I'm a student. And so this is the time to make relationships, work on getting physically healthy. I played so much basketball during that period of time, right? Stretched my mind in different ways. And I felt like business school was a true luxury in life that time because I just did that. So I didn't work while doing that, which is different.
Right.
And so I knew I was investing in relationships. I knew I might never get married, but I wanted to meet best friends. I wanted to meet good friends. And that was what I gave a priority to. And I think had I not had that moment, I probably wouldn't have done it in work, to be honest. And so thinking about your life and going, am I going to give myself a shot at making lifetime relationships, whether it's a partner or just lifetime relationships? I do think in our adult life, that is important to just give yourself that moment because I think it's harder. It's really harder to find that. I'll say something else practically because I have quite a few mentees that I talk to about this kind of stuff. There is a trend now where women are freezing their eggs at a younger age. So there's a practical reality of thinking through those kinds of things, which is, all right, I'm going to freeze my eggs, and if I want to get pregnant later, I will have an option to do some things that become impossible after the age of, 33, 34, I don't know. But there are, we're all trying to figure out how do you be a working woman and still be confined by the limits of our bodies. And that's real. For me, when I ended up, and truth is, we got married, and one of my very good guy friends was like, Amanda, like you are getting younger, and if you guys want to have kids, you better start trying now because this thing is hard. And I was like, oh, So some of it is just like having friends who tell you the truth. And I am lucky, because when I said I made time in business school for really building good friendships, I did. I not only found my husband, which I didn't mean to, but like found really good friends who for the rest of my life now tell you the truth. And there are some truths like, listen, your time is ticking, and if y'all are going to have kids, you got to do it now. So we did, and we were lucky that we got pregnant.
It's definitely, sometimes it can be a sensitive subject to say, hey, this is sort of reality in terms of biology. And it's a question that a lot of people have to figure out. And so in your late 20s, did you ever, before you met Patrick, did anything cross your mind about what am I going to do when I'm older? Because that's always a big thing, is who's going to take care of me when I get older? And that's something that a lot of our parents' generation brings us up on, that, hey, you have kids, so when you get older, they take care of you, and then you take care of their kids, and then the cycle just repeats itself. But then, so we grow up with that mindset. But then in the modern world here now, in the United States and Silicon Valley, it's a different beast now that we're sort of tackling. But did that ever cross your mind in your late 20s before you met Patrick, that, you know what, I'll just sort of figure it out then, or, you know, I'm sure something will come up in terms of later years in life?
I was always pretty set on that I was going to have to figure it out. Yeah, and I guess I had confidence in that I would somehow figure it out. If anything, finding a partner became more complicated, because I was like, wait a second, like now we have to figure it out. There's more people it's almost as though like more people we got to take care of. Like, how are we going to do this? And I have to figure out your job and my job. And so my theory on it was, it is up to me. Like, I made this bet. I mean, it's funny because I've never really thought about this until this conversation, but making that decision when I started telling everybody, I'm just not getting married, I'm not going to have kids, it really was a mindset shift for me too, because it meant that I got it. I've got to like figure this out, and that's possible. And so in some ways, I think it opened up not being worried about who's going to take care of me, because the minute I said it's just going to be me, then it was easy to recognize I got to take care of myself.
Wow. That's very powerful stuff. And I'm so thankful that you said that, because I know it's something that a lot of people want to hear, especially young women now who are, like I said, they're following their career and they're thinking about these questions. It's great life advice there. It's like, what do you do? We're all trying to figure it out. Our generation, when we become 70, 80 years old, you know, the landscape of what our lives are like then is probably going to be different than our grandparents' lifestyle was back then. You know, now that we're living longer, by the time I get to that age, it might be like, hey, you know, life expectancy now is about 110. Like, oh, okay, well, I guess I got to figure out what I'm going to do with the later years of my life now.
Well, and when you really think about it, right? I mean, the journey that I feel like women have gone through is really interesting, because when you're like 7th grade, 8th grade, right? You're, as a girl, supposed to wait for somebody to ask you to dance. And so at a very early age, you learn you've got to wait, or you have to make yourself be askable, right? And then all of a sudden, for those of us who sort of were raised like that, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, I'm going to do this thing on my own. That doesn't, that's a different mindset from when you were in 7th grade waiting for somebody to ask you to dance.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so one of my theories on life is like, how do we teach young girls, you want to dance, you go find somebody to dance with, right? Or you can dance by yourself. Mm-hmm. Like, just those simple social ideas or questions have real implications on how you think about your own life as you become 26 and 27.
Exactly. And it's even from the guy's standpoint there's a lot that we were told that we're supposed to do like that. You're supposed to be willing to go ask. You're supposed to be willing to go find this out. You're supposed to go do everything like that. I had a conversation with a coworker years back he asked, and he was like 24. He's a young guy then, and I was 33 or 34. Not that I was old, but older. And he was asking me about the dating scene. And it's like, what did I do in high school? I just went to go talk to women at the grocery store or wherever. And he made a joke like, that's just too hard. It's too hard. You just go online and ask them. Like, really? Is that what everybody does now? Because I thought you were supposed to go out and just ask people. You don't just, this whole new, at the time for me, the whole new dating market online. It's like, that's how people are meeting now. It's like we send texts back and forth, and then we're supposed to click. I mean, I'm sure it works for some people, but that's not how I did it. So, I was like, it was interesting. It was just interesting to hear that, like, oh, it's a mindset shift in terms of, how we're adjusting to the way the norms are and what can actually happen there. Actually, I wanted to ask you a question about that with Patrick. So, how is your guys' daily life? Because you obviously you're being a CEO. I mean, you're busy, and he's got his own company where he does tremendous work in brain research. I mean, that in itself is it's incredible. Like, how does how does the daily life work when you're both pretty much trying to manage the businesses, but you also have an 8 and an 11-year-old, correct?
Yeah, like 9 and 12.
9 and 12 now.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that?
Pat used to always say, there's a lot of pants in our family. And it's true. It's much more like a business where we're like, what does this week look like? Right around the table, who has pickup, who has drop off, what activities do we have? And so it's a truly shared, complicated partnership in a way that I feel really, really blessed because, I do think it's the way of the future and men and women are going to act in this way more and more, but neither of us grew up in an environment where that was true.
Right. Yeah.
And so I recognize we are writing this. And sometimes my parents, early on in our career would be like, Amanda, you have to do more. Like you need to be cooking and cleaning. I was like, Mom, I'm an awful cook. I am horrible. Pat does not want to eat my food. And so some of it is just like, the practicalities of what skill sets do we have, right? And so I do the bills, he does the cooking, right? And my kids, it's funny because my kids recognize the traditional ways of things, and they sort of realize that you can write this stuff, right? That you can do it yourself, and that this is your family, and this is how you divide up things. But it's a constant for us. And then we try and on a kind of an annual basis say, do we got this right? Do we have this balance right?
Right.
And I was really fortunate in my kids' younger years. I can admit those were the years that he was a really amazing dad and I was not as amazing of a mom. Like I couldn't do the repeat thing, and he loved it. He loved seeing their little brains work as he kept repeating things, right? And so some of it is just being honest with ourselves, like, you really like this age, right? And I'm not as good at this age. And it's fortunate for us that my career at that time was on campaigns, and so I was pretty second parent, and he was first parent. We actually say that, and that worked for us. Now it's pretty even. COVID actually changed a lot of things for us, but I love this age, man. I love the 9 and 12 where they're bantering back and forth with you and. So that's part of it too, is like understanding who you are. Some parents are awesome parents all the way through. I know that there are certain ages that I link with and I'm better at, and Pat would say the same, that there are certain ages he's better at.
Yeah.
That's the point.
It's it brings into reality what we consider gender roles and traditional gender roles, because we grew up in my generation, I'm sure your generation as well, it's like, the man does all this, the woman does all that, and it just works. And we're at an age now where it's not that, it doesn't work that way anymore per se, and we're all learning, we're all trying to figure out what does this way of life actually look like. And in a certain way, I think between some of the men and women that I've talked to in a similar age group as me, in the back of our minds, even though we're trying to work out sort of like this, this power couple dynamic, there's a little bit in the back of us that sort of fights that upbringing of this is, I'm supposed to do that, or you're supposed to do that. And then it's like, okay, well then how are we going to have a partnership when we're both working these full-time careers? It doesn't work that way. So I've just seen from my own point of view, just fighting that upbringing of this is what you're supposed to do. This is how you're supposed, as the guy, you're supposed to go work out 60, 70 hours a week, and you just work at, some people work jobs that they don't like just to make the money to support the family. Like, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. And like, it doesn't have to be that way. But then it kind of comes back down to communication in the very beginning. When you first both get together, it's like, here's my life, here's your life. Are we on the same path? Do we share the same values? Because you have a family, that is going to come into play there that, hey, we did discuss this early on, that we're going to share these duties. We're going to do this. We're going to have to do all that. It's like me and my wife, we kind of sort of call ourselves like the quintessential power couple, because she's got her career. I have mine. She has her interests. I have this thing I'm also doing now. We decided early on that we just weren't going to have kids. It just didn't seem to fit what we were actually doing. I mean, because we're so busy. Even some of my friends who had that family network of 2 grandparents on each side and the cousins who were helping with the babysitting. And we had friends like that who couldn't figure it out because they weren't talking to each other. And we go back and peel back the onion layers. It was like, well, we never really had that conversation in the beginning, what our life was looking like. We thought we were going to figure it out, but we never really knew what that looked like. So like for us, like me and my wife now, it's like, having that conversation early on so we're on the same page, now we know the direction that we're going in. And if it happens later on for us, maybe it does. But for right now, we're so focused on getting our career set that that's what we're actually doing. Yeah. So it's just, it's great to hear from you and what your experiences were, how you guys, it basically started out that way. You had a conversation early on. This is what life's going to be like. So with that, kind of now take me into your time in the Senate, because this is where it gets very exciting here, because not only what you've accomplished, but just the fact that this is when your first child was being born, correct? And you were going through all this.
Both my kids were born in D.C.
They were both born in D.C. Wow. Yeah. So how did that whole thing start out with Senator Feinstein, and then how it just grew into your chief of staff for Debbie Stabenow?
Yeah, so I actually assumed I would be in Washington, D.C. for 1 year and I'd be back to California, because I'm a California girl, right? That was my thinking. And every year got so interesting. And so I worked for Senator Feinstein for the first year. I was doing economic policy for her, really thinking through actually immigration, interesting, and really thinking workforce development during that period of time. And then things changed, right? Obama ended up coming into office, or we ended up going into a presidential race. And for me, Feinstein was on a lot of the committees, but she was on more judiciary. So she was not as much on the finance committees, where that was my background, right? Economics, finance. And so what I quickly learned was, like, where are the things in economics? Like, who is working on finance committee like things where I can actually really add value? And that's how I met Senator Stabenow. She was on the banking committee. She was working her way to the finance committee, on the energy committee, and on the ag committee. And so those are all the things that I could really add value. And I got to know her. I fell in love when I interviewed with her. Daughter of a car dealership. And just such a connection. When I met Senator Stabenow, I realized how and why I believed in institutions like the Senate. If someone like her could end up being a senator from the state of Michigan, this redhead, daughter of, again, a car dealership, total Michigan accent, right? Like, just such a nice, like, a person you would meet in Michigan. And I went, yes, that's what I believe our democratic institutions should feel like and look like, as people who are from there. Michigan through and through. And so when she asked me to join her team and be on her economic committees, it put me in a place where I felt like I could finally make a real difference, where I could use the skills that I had in the committees of jurisdiction. And then from there, we had the recession, and there were very few people in the 2008 recession. There were very few people who had worked on Wall Street who were there. And so I got pulled into discussions around that. And then the auto industry was front and center in all of that. So obviously, working for the senator from Michigan, I got pulled into those conversations. And then fast forward, we end up doing the Affordable Care Act, and Senator Stabenow was on the committee of jurisdiction for healthcare. And so I was literally 8 months pregnant as we were debating whether maternity care should be in or out of the Affordable Care Act.
8 months. That's unbelievable.
I was right there. Like, it was at midnight, and there's a couple pictures of me in the back, like, holding my stomach as we're, like, debating. I mean, the irony of it, right? As we're debating whether maternity care is going to be in the Affordable Care Act. And so it was one after another. And then by the end, she was in a position to become chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee. Mm-hmm. And so we took over the Agriculture Committee, rebuilt all of that. And in many ways, for me, that was a real coming back home, right? Because I grew up in ag country. Yeah. And so I never, ever, ever expected to be there for as long as I was. It was literally every single year. It was like, am I learning? Am I growing? Yes, stay. Am I learning? Am I growing? Yes, stay. Right? Because, of course, my mom and dad were always like, when are you coming back? Right? You're a California girl. And it ended up, being 9-10 years that I was away. And I loved every single year of it. I got a chance to be on the negotiating team for trade agreements with South Korea, Malaysia, as we were going through that. Just the world that I got a chance to see was, again, absolutely fortunate. And I felt like I could add some value from where my life had come from and where my policy and hard work had come from. Wow.
And sort of talk about, and it kind of goes back to your senior thesis that you wrote about women in politics, that 9 years you were there. Yeah. Did you leave Washington with a better sense that the system works if it's put in there correctly, or it's like I'm throwing my hands up in the air and it's like no matter what I said, these things aren't getting done?
I left with the idea that I did all I could from a policy perspective in the positions I was in. And what I realized is at some point you need the lived experience at the highest level that's actually going to vote, right? That's actually going to drive the legislation.
Right.
And so it became very real to me that there aren't enough women, enough people of color, enough folks with lived experience that don't come from rich backgrounds. You could go through the different layers, and you cannot substitute lived experience, right? When people asked, well, how do immigrants today get healthcare, right? And you're like, no, we're going to write a healthcare bill and nobody has any real experience with that, right? So that became real to me, and I recognize that there's a limit to what you can do in a system that actually doesn't have those perspectives and voices in there. And so that's why I went to the campaign side, where I went from policy and institutions to really looking at who's running, how are they running, how can I help drive different perspectives in the campaign section so that we have folks that bring that kind of experience. Frankly, we needed more people like Senator Stabenow who had this lived experience, right? She always would get a little bit frustrated that she wasn't they always put out the richest members, right? And you kind of look at that and you're like, whoa, right? And I'd be like, Debbie, this is why I work for you, is because you didn't come from that, right? And it matters that you are here with that kind of perspective, with that lived experience of what it's like to be a middle class family in the state of Michigan. And we need more of that. And so that's why I went to the campaign side, because how do you get there? You get people to run who actually can bring that.
And that's, I just want to touch on this one point because it's a huge rabbit hole we can get into all day. But really briefly, if you can kind of explain the purpose or the reality of lobbyists and how that most people, if I ask a random person on the street in my age, like, what's a lobbyist? They don't understand what the lobbyist actually does. And then when you explain it to them, you say, oh, that's the reason why these things get voted on. And it's a whole big rabbit hole here. But if you could just sort of briefly tell me about your experience with them and how it really affected just getting things done.
So it's interesting because I actually think lobby has become something that that personifies this idea of big money organizations hire people to go and talk to politicians. I mean, that's the simplicity of it.
Right.
But what it means is it's so hard to get on someone's schedule, and if you have a lot of money, you can figure out how to do that. And those end up becoming what we now term as lobbyists, because they have relationships that they can then get into an office and talk to somebody. And it is true, staffers need that information and understanding. The problem is I actually think there should be a lot more lobbyists from other environments, right? From advocacy groups. And it's advocacy, but they definitely don't have enough money to always get on the schedule in the same way that wealthy corporate lobbyists do. And so, and in today's world, with a couple of laws that have passed, there's more and more money going into corporate lobbying in order to be able to push a policy one way or another. And what happens on the backside, and this is what's unfortunate, is what happens on the backside as a policymaker is that you don't get as much great information from the other side of the story, right? You get a lot of information from folks who have a lot of money to give you that, to create the pretty papers and the analysis and run the studies, but you don't really have the other side of the story enough. And that's where things have become really out of balance, even more so than when I was there. Because as a staffer, you can push so much, but if nonprofits or organizations just don't have enough to give you the materials that can really push back against the biggest arguments, you're kind of at a disadvantage as a policymaker because you're not as equipped. So it's something that even when you try to explain to people, you can paint lobbyists as the most horrible thing in the world, or you can paint them as like
they're pushing their agenda, and the agenda might be something that needs to be pushed out there, whether it's, stuff for the agricultural sector or whatnot. But you're right, more times than not, it's going to be the people who have the bigger checkbooks that get to the senator or the representative's office first and says, here's why we need that pipeline, here's why whatever. I like to think it's not so much on the bribe side of it as much as it's about, hey, let me get in the office, let me tell you why it's going to be a good thing for your constituents, so they'll vote you back in. Oh, okay, that makes sense for who I represent. But because it's a bigger environment now, do you have the time as a representative or senator to say, time out, let me go talk to the other side just so I have a clearer picture as to what it is I'm voting for. So
and that's harder, right? Because if you can't, I remember when Debbie asked me, Senator Stabenow asked me, like, why are you here? Like, you do all kinds of things. Why are you here? And I was like, because of the place that I grew up, not a lot of people can travel to be here, but I can. And hopefully I can be that bridge, right? And so when I think about whatever policy you're talking about, who are the people that can't travel in the room? And what's happened over time is not only do we still have people who can't travel in the room to give the other side of the story, but there's been a heck of a lot more money now given into one side of the story than even 10 years ago. And that's the problem with where I think we're developing policy today. It's
then again, that's a whole big rabbit hole here. We could spend a lot of time, a lot of days going on that, but I want to sort of transition off of that. And as we sort of get back into California, when you left Washington to come back here to run for Congress in your home district, before you left Washington, can you just sort of explain how you're just like the daily routine of being a senator or being the chief of staff, like the hours you were putting in, and by the way, you were 8 months pregnant doing this, and what's sort of the other side that people would never know about, like the conversations you and Patrick may have been having at the time about, hey, this is what I have to do and this is what I need from you and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you're always on, right? You don't, as a chief of staff to a member of Congress or an elected official, you really don't have off. There's no such thing as off. And so you were always, at the time, was BlackBerries at the time. I'd always have it on. And I think that was the hard part, right? You'd be out, and you'd get a call and you'd have to answer it. That part never goes away and is pretty consistent with every chief of staff. What does that mean? That's everything from like your boss got stuck at the airport, who's going to go help, somebody broke into her house, or like the rain happened and like the patio fell through, who's going to go help do that. And so it's kind of like the president needs to talk to Senator Stabenow right now. How do we do that? And so it's all those things wrapped up. And that's why it is 100% of the time, right? And then it's like really big decisions, like is she going to vote for the financial bailout or not? And you are the last conversation before she actually goes down to the floor to vote, right?
Wow.
So it's things like that too. And so it is a beautiful, in this sense, I was very lucky to work for such an amazing woman, and who is amazing heart and mind, but who taught me a ton about, she was a social worker by training, right? There's not a lot of social workers on the Hill. There was actually one other. And so just to give you a sense of like, that's the kind of person I want to work for. But it's the full gamut of their lives, their policies, their logistics, and the responsibility of the country at times where we were trying to get a major farm bill passed, or they were counting votes on the financial bailout and she was a no. And so you get a call from president's office going like, Amanda, why is she a no, right? And you're like, listen, what can you do about it? And you're like, I'm not the senator, right? And you defend her, right? And you're like, here's why. Here are the reasons why she's going to go there, and you should go somewhere else, and because she's not moving on this, right? And so you are. The other thing I used to say is the chief of staff is often the world of uncomfortable conversations, because the senator doesn't really have uncomfortable conversations, right? You tee it up where things are pretty set.
Yep.
So you have to be the deliverer of all the uncomfortable news. But it's a real lesson of like human connection, because in uncomfortable moments, right, in tough news times is when we need most of our humanity leaning forward. And so I feel like it was, from a training standpoint, really gave me a sense of, how do you stay human in these very tough moments?
Unbelievable. Really quickly, for my listeners in the podcasting forum, if you would like to leave a review on the Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I appreciate it if you do so. If you're watching this on YouTube, I would appreciate it if you would take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel so I can help get this information out there. Now, how about when you come home and like just you're dealing with all this, especially on these bigger votes on the Senate floor about this needs to get done. You're getting phone calls from the president's staff, and you got one person in your ear here, and you got another person in your ear here. Then you're trying to talk to the senator about what needs to get done. And oh, by the way, you're going to go home at the end of the night eventually. What is that transition like? And were there ever like sort of conversations where it's like, hey, right now I need time to process everything that I just had to deal with that affects the entire nation? So like, this sort of ties back into the family communication part of it. Of like, how did you guys work through that at a tough time? Because I know a lot of people in my generation, especially, that's a big one. Is do you understand what I'm doing at work, and how can we work to make sure we're on the same page with that? One
of the things that I'm really fortunate. Pat is an amazing man, just an amazing human being. And one of the things that he did during that period of time is he would watch things like The West Wing, and he would keep up with the news. And so in some ways, he was interested enough in the work that I was doing. Mm-hmm. He would talk about being, quote, the man on the street. So I would come home and he'd be like, Amanda, you know what the man on the street thinks about this? But it was a really cool way of being engaged in the work so that there wasn't this huge separation. By the same token, I read Scientific American Mind. He's in the brain space, and I find the brain fascinating. I would do some of the programs that he would talk about and know about just so I would be connected to his work. And I'm fascinated by it. And so, we did that just out of curiosity, but I probably think it's a good habit for partners to get into. How do you stay connected in a way that's really still keeps you interested, your partner interested, but not all in, right? Like man on the street is cool, but I don't need him telling me what policy we need to pass tomorrow, right?
Yes.
But complete disconnection as well is probably not healthy. So the fact that he's like, oh, I heard you had a bad day because I saw the news about XYZ. And I was like, yeah, right? So he would know.
Gotcha.
And that, I think, never really thought through it, but that's probably a good just habit in general, right? Understand the curiosities of what your partner is doing to stay in it.
That definitely, it's pretty much, if anybody knows politics, it's the exact opposite of Kellyanne Conway and her husband and about everything that goes on there, if you know politics there. All right, so that's very powerful advice because it gets down to the bare roots of, hey, I got 70, 80, 100-hour a week job, but really affecting the entire country, and I come home at the end of the night, how do we have that conversation where we're both not tearing each other's heads out or whatnot, and then dealing with childcare and everything that goes along with that. So very important advice to give to young women and young people. So now we transition back. You come back to California, and what was it that made you say, you know what, Washington, I appreciate the experience that I had there. I'm coming back to California. Did it click for you right away that that you wanted to run for Congress for your district, or it took some thinking?
No, my initial reaction was like, all right, who are we going to get to run? Who are we going to get to run in this district? Because it was one of the tightest districts by the numbers. And one of my girlfriends, again, it's important to have good friends around to tell you the truth. And one of my girlfriends, while we were at dinner in DC, was like, listen, man, you are the person that often says, if not you, who? Why is this not, if not you, who? And that struck pretty hard, damn her.
Wow.
But it was right? You're going to go around preaching this stuff. You got to walk the walk too. And that was scary. That whole moment, learning how to be a candidate, learning how to talk about your opinions, especially when I'd been in training for a decade of not having an opinion and instead leaving room for my boss to have an opinion, right? Saying you can look at it this way or you can look at it that way, right? And you let your, the senator then decide where she's going to be. And all of a sudden people wanted to know what I thought. And that was it took some getting used to figure out how to be me, right? Mm-hmm. How to say, here is what I think, or here is how I position something. And I think the other part was a coming back home and learning where you came from again. I think the hardest part for me was the reality that as I was knocking on the doors and realizing, wow, I had all these opportunities. I think in your mind, you think wherever you left is also moving along with you. right? Like more kids must be going to Stanford.
Yeah,
More
you're
kids
right.
must be, you want to believe that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The teams must be better than when I was there. And to come back and knock on doors and realize things hadn't gotten easier, but they've gotten harder. And there wasn't more hope. There was less hope. That was actually really quite, that was hard. That was hard to see, hard to think about, hard to unwind for me. Like, what do you mean? All these policies I thought I had been passing around, I had been brought my lived experience to DC and it didn't come down? Like, what happened? And so that for me was, one of those moments where you kind of go, you can never forget where your roots are and you can never stop checking in, right? Of the people and the places that you care about.
So during that whole campaign run you were doing, what was the real big lesson that really sat home with you? Like, why is my community not getting better than where I thought they maybe should have been when I left 10 years ago or whatnot? And what could I knowing how Washington actually works, with the experience that you had there, did it ever, how were you processing, what can I promise my constituents, that I could actually really believe can get done, knowing what it takes just to get one bill passed and whatnot. Yeah. And then how do you explain it to people? Because, voters, we just, okay, right now, are you going to do this? Okay, great. So if I vote for you, I expect A, B, and C. And then a lot of us who vote don't realize that, just trying to get one agenda passed is like, can be like moving heaven and earth because you're dealing with so many people who have to sign off on that. And then, but you don't want to also be a cynic to your group and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go fight for A, B, and C. And if I get the job, I may never get all of them because that's the way Washington works. How do you sort of balance that?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. One, I actually think there's a lot that an elected official can do outside of actual legislation. So partly the reason why I ran is because I had at least a year, as was my boss was chairwoman of the agriculture committee, of really understanding ag programs in a really hyper kind of way and recognizing that the place that I grew up wasn't actually working with the agencies in a way that could really drive what communities needed, not just what farmers needed, which has always been represented by farmers, but what community leaders needed. That was a missing piece, whether it was helping write grants, whether it was helping connect to USDA. So there's all kinds of work. And again, remember, I was like a staffer behind the scenes, so I could see the programs and the implementation of programs.
Right.
And we were missing them in the Central Valley. And so there is a ton you can do. And I said it then, I still say it now. There is a ton you can do if you just want to get your hands into the work trying to connect with the agency. Wow. I still believe that today. And it's still represented by farmers and not by community leaders. And I think that you can see that in the kind of policies that happen in the Central Valley. Now, one of the biggest lessons I took away was when we were doing focus groups, and my focus group, the folks who really voted for me were older Latina women, were the folks who would vote for me when they saw Amanda Renteria. But I was at a fair and I ran into a woman who was she's my target, right? So I talked to her and she's like, Mija, listen, I know you. I'm so excited that you're doing this and I'm supportive of you, but don't you think we need somebody like them to represent us? And that hit me in a way that I started to realize perhaps the issue is that we don't see ourselves as being able to lead. And how did that happen?
Wow.
Right? How did that happen in the place that I grew up? And then you start asking yourself, and you're like, well, it happened because there aren't faces. There aren't stories like mine who are leading in this environment and never have been in the region. And so it was my decision, as when we did our ads, I could be Amanda sports girl done good and yay, right? Or I could be Amanda Renteria, daughter of farm workers who had these opportunities and now wants to give back. And I decided to be Renteria and not Amanda, right? Because I, at that moment, realized we are never going to be empowered as a community if we don't see ourselves as leaders who can change our future. And so that's why my ads were about my parents. And that's also why I then went to go work for Hillary Clinton, because I thought if we could at least change the image by gender,
wow.
right? our kids are going to grow up thinking they could be that, because there's nothing worse for me, nothing more disempowering than to believe you can't lead or that you need someone else to lead. That's incredible right there to hear that. And even though it didn't work out for you as far as the election goes, do you feel that that message got out there at the time before you joined the Hillary Clinton campaign, that people started saying, that's exactly what we needed to do? Sometimes when I go back to some restaurants in the Central Valley, people are like, Mika, how are you? How did it go? And I was like, some people didn't know I didn't win, right? Really? Especially right after I've been on TV so much there, right? People were like, oh, so Mika, like things are good. And then I was on the Hillary campaign, right? And so I was on TV still on the Hillary campaign doing interviews there. And so people just thought I won, right? So I was like, and I remember telling my mom, I was like, Mom, I don't know if I should correct them or if I should, and at the beginning I would say, did you vote? And they're like, hi, Mika, no, I didn't have time to vote. But like, things are good, right? And I was like,
didn't have time to vote.
I didn't win, right? Man. And then over time, I just stopped telling people I didn't win and just be like, things are great and don't forget to vote. And I just started moving in that direction, because if my goal was to have someone like me seem like they could win, and if they believe that, then I suppose one could argue I accomplished the idea that a leader can look like me, right? It can look like and have my story and their story.
Well, you did manage to get President Obama out here to fundraise for you. And he spoke, I don't know the exact quote, but he said you're one of two women that he wants to see go farther in politics. And then President Joe Biden came out. Yeah. So for all my Republican listeners out here, just bear with me. He came out to also support you. And it was a great thing. But at the end of the day, what do you think was the disconnect there? Was it just a familiarity with, okay, there's this person who won, he's always been there, so why try to fix what's not broken? Or was it just something maybe deep inside people's minds that it didn't really click for me or whatnot?
So one of the things about elections is math, right? Mm-hmm. So when you just look at what happens in midterms, the history of midterms, the history of the numbers and who comes out during a midterm, just because that's how people vote, or they don't know, it was always going to be hard to overcome the math. Still to this day, that district, although it's all changing, but it hasn't been won in a midterm. It's only been won in a general election. So you can't, I suppose some of the lesson is you can't defy math, even if you really, really, really want to. And the second piece to it is remembering that to do something for the first time is scary, and there's a reason why it hasn't been done before. Yes, right? Yep. I mean, so I could talk about being the first at Stanford and all the path I had to pave, right? Because it had never been done before. But there's a reason why it was tough for people to do.
Right.
And I think the dose of reality about that, not only in my election, but then trying to help the first woman get elected, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, there are truths to the fact that when you are different and no one's ever seen that before, it is harder, period. It always has been. No course of history has changed that.
Correct.
And so, yeah.
That's very important stuff there. But you didn't let it get you down, which is very impressive, because shortly after that, you joined Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign at the time. And again, all my Republican friends, just bear with me. This is an exciting story. There's a lot of lessons here. I have to throw that out there because some people hear that and they go click. It's like, what?
There was a whole Republicans for Hillary during that period of time. They meant it.
That's incredible. So talk to me about your position. You were the political director, which from my understanding, you were pretty much one of the top 3 people that spoke to Hillary. Am I correct?
3, I'd say 5, 7.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, someone that went on the plane with her quite a bit. Yes.
So what is that really entail? Because you were going pretty much, you hit 30 some odd states in the union plus a couple of territories. So you were flying all over the country during that campaign.
Yeah, you don't know what time it is. You don't know what day it is. You don't know where your kids are. I mean, it's you are seeing the world, the country, in fast forward, and you're seeing all of it. You are going to every corner of the country, right? And one day you're in Arizona, the next day you're in Florida, the next day you're in Michigan. Sometimes you're in a school, sometimes you're in a field at a football stadium. Sometimes, I mean, it's just the input, the stimulus that's coming at you of the American people, what people are saying, what people want out of a leader, all of it. And then you're managing real issues at the time, right? I was the senior advisor who was sent to Flint to meet with the mayor.
I saw that,
and,
yes.
And I remember sitting there and going to the restaurant and right in Flint downtown, and the waitress puts the glass of water there, and you just sort of look at it, and she looked at me and she says, "Yeah, I don't know what to do either." Right? And you're just like, oh, the realness of that moment, right? Or going home and saying goodnight to your kids, recognizing my kids they don't have to shower in that water, right? They don't have to drink that water. So there's a depth of responsibility and humility on a presidential campaign where you want to figure out, how do you make it all work? How does this delicate balance of democracy work? And how do you bring in all these different voices and all these different pieces of a campaign, and then tell the story of a new vision for the country? It was hard. It was hard when you're trying to really be that bridge to it all, right? The different constituency groups, the different elected officials in different parts of the country. But that is the challenge of a presidential campaign, is you really are trying to bring the fabric together and say, here's where we can go together as a country. That particular cycle was also the first time we've had such intense language, right? Intensity between the different parties, between the candidates, in a way that we hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
Particularly with a woman, right? Inject a woman, right? I mean, it was almost even more normal to see Biden and Trump, these two guys sort of duking it out. Like,
right.
We've seen that over the course of history. It was a little bit weird to be paving a different kind of picture. And so, yeah, there are so many different feelings that I probably still haven't untangled them all. I think it would always shape me, because it didn't just shape me in terms of trying to get the country to come out, but it shaped me in a way that I learned about who we were too, who we were as a country. I learned how forgotten people had felt, and how intensely I saw some real intensity around what does it mean to have a woman actually lead the most powerful country in the world, and the scariness of that for some people in the country. I also got to see the hope of young women who were like, I'm not worried about this. We're going to have a woman president, and all of a sudden get shocked by the fact that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So many different feelings and pieces that you think through every single day.
Well, I do want to talk about the end result later on, but really fast, in the beginning, while you were going through that experience, did it feel different than when Obama was running in 2008? And was there a different vibe? Did you still get the inspiration that people were talking about with him across the country? Or was it just a different vibe that, hey, we have this opportunity to have this really powerful woman potentially be president of the United States, and here's something different? Or was it just a different vibe that you got? Because I'm not sure, you weren't really involved in Obama's campaign, but you sort of kind of felt the sentiment out there, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was Senator Stabenow was running at the time in 2006, and so I could, you could feel the energy, right? So I think the story or the arc of Obama was people didn't believe it could happen, and then people started believing it could happen, and then it happened, right? So if you think about that as the wave, right? The wave sort of, wasn't much there. You had to get it going. And then it just started moving in a direction, and it felt like that. I can't say that was the tide or the wave of what it felt like for our campaign, because you didn't have, again, talking in focus groups where you had a lot of people saying, of course there's going to be a woman. What's the big deal? It wasn't this sense of inspiration of we are breaking a barrier at all, ever. It never really felt like that.
Anywhere in the country, you never got that vibe.
I mean, I will say older women who I think really understood the plight of women's leadership in a way that they had to fight themselves just to be at the tables. They understood it in their bones. I could feel almost the different generations where I would have ladies hugging me and crying and thanking me for being helping this finally happen in their lifetime. They're going to see it before they die. How many emotional conversations I had with women, older women, and then yet a whole nother world with younger women. It's meh, it's fine.
That's actually it's surprising to actually hear that, because at the time, 6 years ago or whatnot, you're talking to millennial women who are probably in their late 20s, early 30s. And like we talked about earlier, they're going places. They got great careers. They're making lots of money, great education. And you're telling me you're talking to them, and it's not really clicking. Like
No.
is it more of like, I'm focusing on me and that I don't care about politics, or, Hillary, that's a different generation. I don't really relate to her.
It's a little bit not relating to her, but it was mostly, and this was even Gen Xers, like my colleagues. It was mostly, hey, we've been doing pretty well. Like every single year I'm like moving in these kinds of course it's just going to happen. And I think in retrospect, even I'll give my own self-criticism, is that was naive. To think like, one of the things my mom said after the entire thing was over is she was like, okay, mija, ahora es tu tiempo. Like now it's your turn to fight the battles that we fought. Right. And perhaps the lesson here is every generation needs to fight their own battles. And I'm not sure women around the world actually took that. I think we thought we might have been past certain things. I don't think anyone today would believe what we're seeing on Roe v. Wade right now, or could believe that birth control could be taken away. Like it is in some states an actual conversation. I don't think any of us would have believed that we'd be having that kind of conversation, right? And so, so I'd go to talk to young women, millennials, or my colleagues, and be like, man, that's not that big of a deal if there's a woman president. Is it really? I'm like, yes, I think it is. Now it feels much more like a big deal, right? And now as I think about those older ladies crying, I myself wonder whether we will see it in our lifetime.
Wow. I mean, that's ultra powerful there, because it sort of made sense that during the campaign, when there was that a message out there that you could have the first women president, and then it didn't work out that way. Did you really see, when you look at the numbers as best as you can, was it really that the electorate that we thought just didn't even come out to vote? And was that like a reflection on our message, or was it just the sentiment around the country, especially and particularly maybe millennial and Gen X women, was that, whatever, politics just don't get me. So,
it was such a different. Even when you look at the math, presidential campaign, by the way, is always going to be close. Just by the way the math works, but it was such a different election. I mean, some things are pretty nefarious now, and we knew they looked weird. Some of the things that we were seeing in Florida looked very weird, and now that we know, and some of the stuff that's come out about misinformation about some of the Russian, some of the Russian impacts are real. So I do wonder about those things, because you're kind of like, we knew these things were weird, that they were not explainable. We had not seen them in the past. So there was some of that. I mean, it feels like it was like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? At the very end, when there was the news about the computer and everything that happened with the latest with FBI at that time, that had an impact. All of it was just like a slice here and a slice there, until all of a sudden, the math doesn't work. And I do think, we were on a progressive route of electing different voices and different people. And so it felt like that was just a trajectory. And so, it was hard to imagine we'd be where we are right now. And I do have to say, like, as I look at like even our world right now, where you're looking at Zelensky and Biden and Putin, and it's all men. Like in a world where we have an empowered women voices now around the world, maybe we don't as much as we thought, right? And what would it mean if we could at least have, let's name all those names of authoritarian regimes right now. They're not women. Yep. I mean, right? Like maybe we'd be just better, or let's try it. Let's try the 50%.
Did anybody ever talk about the example in Germany with Angela Merkel? Because she was there leading that country for, 15, 20 years? She was there a long, long time. Was that ever brought up as an example of like, this is an example of what we want to see?'t how Germany's doing and whatnot, or her name never really came up?
It does. I mean, it does come up in sort of the international geopolitical world, but it didn't locally. I mean, domestically. And, I also just think, again, kind of going back to what is the image of leadership, I think we as a country, I think, are still figuring out what we want in a woman leader. Do you want them to be like Angela Merkel? Do you want them to be like Hillary Clinton? Do you want them to be like Ann Richards of Texas, right? What is it, right? Is it Sarah Palin, right? Like, what is it? And I'm struggling with what Americans would say, this is my ideal female president leader. This is what they look like. This is what they sound like. We don't have that yet.
That's a very interesting thing. And I really want to, because you were there on November 8th, 2016 in New York City, right? When the election results came in. So I definitely want to get a sense from you of what the feeling was around there and some of the conversations they may have been had. But before I do that, I want to let everybody know that I'm going to take this conversation to my Patreon page. So this is for all my supporters who are supporting the channel. Thank you so much. If you would like to hear this part of the conversation, please just click on the link in the YouTube channel or the Apple Podcast link. It'll take you to my Patreon page where you can get all the bonus content. The last thing I want to ask is, because I know you got to get out of here soon, any thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, and the idea that they keep throwing about World War III if it comes down to it?
Yeah. I'm incredibly nervous for our world right now. I've been nervous about authoritarian regimes for some period of time now. Seeing geopolitics over the last administration and the way different autocracies were becoming more empowered is real, and we're seeing some of that now. But I can't help but also feel a deep sense of hopefulness in seeing a leader like Zelensky, who is walking the walk of a leader. I mean, how many times have we, I think in this country, just seen such skepticism and cynicism about what political leadership looks like? Right? It's not lost on me when you see elected officials make rules and then they don't follow them, right? I mean, everybody can probably think of 5 examples off the top, right?
Yes.
To see someone actually put their life on the line as a leader, to see someone put their families in the kind of harm's way he did, particularly early on, and it still is now, right?
Yep.
We know what Putin wants to do. He's walking the walk in a way that I feel like is so needed in political leadership in the country and the world.
There we go.
Right? Political leadership in the country and the world right now. That what gives me hope is if we can redefine elected leadership like that and shame people who actually do the opposite, we will be a better government, a better country going forward. And so I am scared about World War III and what it all means and that we could be in World War III. And it wouldn't completely shock me because I'm not sure we have levers to stop it at the moment. I think we have individuals who might not stop it, right? And we don't get that choice.
That's true. I mean, just from your experience in Washington, do you see the possibility of some sort of back deal or back channel deal where Putin gets something of what he wants, he gets to save face, and everybody just sort of diminishes everything, or pretty much everybody's got their feet dug in the sand and this is where we're going. So at some point, it's going to trigger involvement of other countries, and that's going to start that domino effect.
I think we're at a really precarious time exactly right now, right? And it feels to me, just looking at the way the people are positioning, is that people don't see Putin backing down. And preparing for that to be the case. So then the question is just going to be, how do all of the countries respond? And is this a long World War III, or is this no, we are actually stopping Putin? But we're really right now in that conversation. You've seen the UN try to start opening up conversations about the Red Cross, et cetera, humanitarian corridors, et cetera. But it's very much going to be what Putin wants to do. I mean, it really is interesting how one person really does define all of our lives and our world.
Right.
And on the other hand, Zelensky is also showing another way. And it is going to be, which one does the world choose in these next couple of days, months?
Right. And then if you try to appease them and say, you know what, take Crimea, take the Donbass region, here's Ukraine's new border, call it a day, then what does that set the precedent for in the future? What does it do for China and Taiwan?
That's right.
And, it's so convoluted, and some people don't think about it that way, because the easy answer might be, just give Russia that territory, what they want to be a Russian anyway, right? So no harm, no foul. And you don't understand what the precedent that sets in. It's like a bully. If you give it to him now, it's like he's going to come back. He's going to want something else. At some point, it's like, what do you do with it?
Yep.
It's a crazy world that we're living in. Really fast, I forgot to ask you about it. I know we've talked so much, and it's been such a great conversation. Really fast, if you could just explain to me your new company, Code for America, what that's about.
Code for America. So Code for America, we're a tech nonprofit, nonpartisan. We partner with government to improve systems that particularly affect low-income folks. So a good example of that is the child tax credit. We actually did the mobile app in Spanish and English with the White House and Treasury because we knew the IRS didn't have that kind of technology. And so we were able to build it and do it as fast as we could. Another example is we are trying to help courts figure out how to comply with laws. Like in the state of Utah right now, they have automatic record clearance. So when a law passes, like let's say somebody has on their record cannabis at levels that are now legal, but they still have a criminal record, and so they can't get certain jobs, and they can't. That should be an automatic process where when the law changed, that record is no longer there because it's no longer illegal. Utah, the state of Utah, we helped code with them. They now have the coding that is able to actually update laws automatically.
Wow.
So to the extent that we can live in a world that when something passes, it actually moves through the system and works.
Yes.
That's the idea, because I still believe at the end of the day, democracy has to deliver. And when we see things happen and we vote for certain things, but then all of a sudden it passes, but we don't see a different change in our lives,
right,
then it doesn't feel like it works so much for us, right? So,
unbelievable. That's great work you guys are doing over there, and I'm glad to hear that. And life of a CEO, I'm sure you would explain, compared to the life of being a senator, the chief of staff, do you find it easier? It's the same workload, or I get to go home faster, or I get to work from home easier?
It is equally busy, but in different ways. And I am humbled by the fact that I get to work with amazing people, whether I was a public servant or now working with nonprofit, where our organization has a real passion for making the world better, making people's lives better. That's what I want to wake up to every day, and I am honored to be able to do that.
What is your final piece of advice for millennial women, especially, who are trying to make it in this world? They're trying to make these decisions here. They're trying to follow a path of, I want my career, but I also want a family. I want everything that society tells me I'm supposed to do. What's your final message of encouragement or reality to them about what to expect out there?
Yeah. I think right now I would say quiet the noise, right? I think to the extent, I think women, particularly professional women, especially in the ages where you're trying to figure out like becoming adult and what the rest of your life looks like. If we could just quiet the noise and not actually put those expectations on ourselves and just be what we want to be, where we want to be, trust yourself, because that answer is the right answer, not what you were supposed to do or what people expected of you. And so in some ways, the answer is already there. It's just how do you quiet the rest of the noise?
And you're not a failure if you don't accomplish one of those objectives that maybe society says you're supposed to do, because maybe that's not your right path, or maybe there's something else you can do better. Yeah. Maybe if it's not having kids, you're making an impact in children's lives who are already here, who don't have support or whatnot, and just looking at the world differently.
Yeah.
Amanda Renteria, thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate you spending time to talk to me about this. I know you have to get going. And where can people find you? What's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah. Well, Twitter at Amanda Renteria is probably the best place I live. I also am at Amanda Public Service on Instagram. And I'm just out there. So come join us at Code for America as well. We're always hiring. We're always looking to do great work. And we welcome passionate people who want to make a difference.
I'm sure you're going to get a lot of inquiries about that after this conversation. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you everybody for listening and watching on YouTube. Again, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. That way it really helps the channel out. Plus, it helps me get the information out there to everybody. And please share this episode with all your friends and families. This has been a really impactful conversation. I learned a lot. I know you have too. Let's get this message out there to the rest of the world. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone.